Good afternoon, and welcome to the Early Executive Roundtable. This month, we are talking about artificial intelligence, and we have our special guest, Tom Davenport, who's author of The AI Advantage, and we're going to be talking about practical steps to realizing the promise and benefits of AI. So thank you for joining, Tom. Good afternoon.
Thanks, Seth. So this is the early executive roundtable. I was thinking it was the late executive roundtable. No,
the late executive roundtable. Yeah, that's a little bit late, a little bit later in the day than we usually do it. So in terms of the folks who are not familiar with early information science, we are a professional services firm that has been around for 25 years, working in the area of information management, information architecture, information strategy, and we make information more findable, valuable, and usable. And you can see we have lots of awards and logos and so on. So we're awesome. That's what everybody says. We're awesome. That's what the slide says. This is the awesomeness slide. But actually, we are honored to be named as one of the important organizations in knowledge management for the 6th year in a row. Just a little bit of housekeeping. That's the end of my commercial pitch. A little bit of housekeeping. We're going to go about 45 minutes or so, and we are going to record. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to listen to it later and get the slides. You can ask questions. There's an Ask Questions tab, so feel free to pipe in anytime you'd like. We are going to have a couple of polls, so appreciate your participation in those. And we do have additional articles and different resources that will be available on the Attachments tab. So again, Tom Davenport, and Tom, maybe you could just do a little quick intro and tell folks about your interest in what you've been doing in the space, and then we jump into a little bit of background slide.
Sure. So, like you, Seth, I a number of years ago was involved in knowledge management. Departed that field more or less for analytics around 2004, 2005 or so, and published a lot of stuff on analytics and big data. And then that evolved into AI, which maybe you could say in some ways is the intersection of analytics and knowledge management. And wrote this book, The AI Advantage, last year, and wrote a previous book on what AI means for jobs and skills with Julia Kirby called Only Humans Need Apply in 2016.
Yeah, and I think it is an interesting observation to see how these are circling back. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but the whole knowledge infrastructure, the knowledge architecture, knowledge engineering, especially on the cognitive types of applications, is more important than ever. And it is that interesting intersection. You know, I wanted to just talk a little bit about AI applications. And I found this infographic, and these folks have been, pestering me to share it. So here I am sharing it. And the question is, are these AI applications or are they applications? And this is what is interesting. So much of the stuff that we're seeing these days is an extension. And the way I look at this is, AI has been around. I'm going to steal my thunder from a future slide, but it's being embedded in lots of things. And there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of what people are calling AI applications, right? They're applications that are using some of these technologies to be more effective, but a lot of them we've done for what's a safety check application, right? What's a customized interface, content analysis, smart ticketing? These are very ambiguous. And then there's others that have been around for a while, recruitment, spam filtering, search recommendations. Those can happen in various ways with rules-based and statistical approaches. And then there's a lot of aspirational stuff, like plot control gaming and, automated journalism, AI coach. Some of these things are happening very at their very early stages, and they do or can leverage machine learning and AI. But look at this again. There's a lot of stuff that we've been doing for a long time. Market analysis, segmentation, store optimization, risk identification, all these things have been done. And I love this one, autopilot. Well, guess how long autopilot has been around? Well, autopilot started in 1914. Now, obviously, these things have evolved. Obviously, they're more capable, and and as we know with the recent issues with the autopilot on the Boeing planes, it's certainly not perfect and problematic. But the point here is that people are using these terms very loosely now, and it used to be that when people, this professor had this quote: "When AI works, it gets co-opted by some other part of the field. So by definition, it doesn't work. If it works, it's not AI, because you call it something else." But it is now everything is called AI, right? We have these things. If people are referring to any type of application, and all these things that we used to call text analytics is now AI. So it went from nothing is AI, and AI doesn't work, to everything is AI. So the question is, what's the reality, and where do you start, and how do you really take advantage of this stuff? So I want to start with the first poll to say, where are you in this? And the question is, it is such a broad term, right? It's almost like saying the prior, and please take a look at this poll, and you can, I think Sharon is pushing this out now, so you can start answering this. But my first question was, how important is AI in the organization? And it's almost like saying, well, how important are computers in the organization? Because it is embedded in so many things. The question is, how is the organization looking at it? And are they looking at it as something that is meaningful, truly meaningful, and going to be changing what you're doing? Are they funding plans for investigation? Are they aware but don't think it's important? Do they have a greater level of understanding and putting budgets in for doing things? So, you can start to see that I'm seeing more of AI in the strategic roadmaps of organizations with serious capability development. But again, there's still a lot of misperceptions out there. Tom, what are your thoughts in terms of what you're seeing in the majority of organizations?
Well, Seth, I think in large companies, large U.S. companies, I would say 20 to 30% have substantial activity in AI underway. The other, 70 or 80% don't, or maybe they have a little bit of piloting going on. Those who are doing it are quite enthused in all of the surveys that I've been involved in, maybe a little less enthused than they were a year or two ago in terms of how easily it's going to transform their organizations, but still a lot of positive feelings and a lot of investment. I was talking recently with some people from JP Morgan Chase who said they were investing $5 billion a year in AI, and that's a substantial amount of money by almost any...
Maybe you can give me that contact, because I haven't been able to get anywhere with those guys.
You want some of that $5 billion? Yeah.
I want a little bit of that $5 billion. I don't need much. What's so funny though is you see these extremes. You see people saying we're going to spend billions of dollars, and you see other organizations saying, well, we have to do something, a $50,000 pilot or POC. So clearly, I'm talking to the wrong people, but I think it is really interesting to see that level of investment. By the way, we'll still take a couple more votes if folks are still interested. The poll is still open. But it looks like, from what I'm seeing here, the majority say there's little understanding at the executive level. There's a couple of people saying that there's a broad understanding, but no plans for investigation, which is interesting. And then there's looks like a third saying it's really part of the strategic roadmap. So that's really interesting, though. $5 billion. In what period of time, Tom, did they say that?
I don't know. That's a good question. Could it be a year? Is that crazy?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll have to go back and look at that, because obviously that's a pretty salient question.
Yeah.
But just to go back to some of the poll results, I think I did a survey of large organizations in the U.S. recently, and about more than a third said they had a strategic roadmap and they had an AI center of excellence and so on. So I would be reluctant to advise any company to rely on being able to be a fast follower in this space. I think the amount of learning that's necessary and the amount of data that you have to accumulate to do it well, I think suggests not waiting and getting going.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there are situations where it does make sense to be, as you say, a fast follower, right? But then there are other situations where, the advances are happening so quickly that you can lose your strategic advantage, or you can miss a strategic advantage very, very quickly. I think the window for doing these things is much shorter.
Well, and there's such a big gap between the most aggressive firms and the less aggressive ones. I mean, even among the aggressive ones, there's a huge gap by industry. I was talking recently to Pfizer, where they said they had more than 150 AI initiatives underway, and that's of course very impressive. But Google, I think in 2016, said they had over 1,700 machine learning initiatives underway. So, more than 10 times, and I'm sure they're not even counting now, there's so many. So if you think that Google or Amazon or Facebook or whatever are going to enter your space, I mean, that's the feeling of Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase. He said, we want to have all the capabilities of Amazon before Amazon enters our industry.
Right.
And that requires a lot of aggressive activity.
Well, yeah, you want to have the capabilities of Amazon before Amazon has the capabilities of your organization, and
Exactly.
and that's going to happen pretty quickly. Yeah, that is really interesting. And I did read in the Wall Street Journal about how Amazon was really getting into the banking space and making inroads, and there was a very interesting story about J.P. Morgan Chase. So what are you seeing in terms of when you're starting to see organizations getting successful value and getting value? What are you seeing as the low-hanging fruit? What are you seeing as the things? I mean, I know people are looking at robotic process automation, but RPA. Besides RPA, what else? Maybe you can just talk about RPA for a moment. What are you seeing, Tom?
Well, someone once described to me that RPA is the gateway drug for AI, and I think there's some truth to that. It's legal in all 50 states, which is good. It increasingly, I mean, I've criticized it in the past for not being very intelligent, but getting smarter all the time, and more companies are combining it with both, as you suggested, Seth, things that used to be called AI, like OCR, and things that are still more or less called AI, like pretty sophisticated machine learning and automated text analytics and so on. So I do think it's a good start, and it tends to have pretty high ROI. It's not that difficult to develop. In fact, I don't know what your professional services firm thinks about it, Seth, but some professional services firms I've worked with have said, this stuff is just too easy. People don't need enough consulting help for it. It's horrible. So it's I think in general, it's a good way to get your feet wet. But I don't think there's a whole lot of strategic advantage from it, and you have to do it on a really large scale to even get a big dent in your productivity in an organization, a positive dent, I should say.
Yeah, and it's interesting because robotic process automation can be considered from a number of different perspectives. I mean, one of the financial services groups that we work with, their chief digital officer did some. He calls it RPA on the cheap. He did it with baling wire and duct tape and chewing gum, and just coded things together. But it was an integration, and it was RPA-ish. But what it did was it demonstrated enough savings, enough value for them to start to continue down the path. So I agree with you that it's that stepping stone that can move forward. So beyond that, what are you starting to see? I mean, obviously, predictive analytics has had a lot of value in an organization that's been around for a while. What else are you starting to see that's more AI-ish?
Well, I mean, I think for any organization that has been doing analytics for a number of years, it's a pretty small step into machine learning. And in fact, the simplest forms of machine learning are basically predictive analytics, using supervised learning. So, if you do a model based on some data for which you know the outcome, and then you say, gee, I want to apply this to some data for which I don't know the outcome, that is both predictive analytics and machine learning. I mean, obviously there are more sophisticated versions of it involving, things like deep learning and neural networks and so on, but it's a pretty easy step into machine learning if you've done anything with even, regression analysis in the past. And I argue that all analytics groups should say, yeah, sure, we're doing machine learning, and otherwise somebody else in the company is going to get all the glory for venturing into AI.
It's funny. I at one of the conferences I spoke at, there were a bunch of information architects, and I said, there's really there is difference between information scientist and information architect, but in some cases, a lot of the work that information scientists are doing is information architecture, right? To prepare the data, to normalize the data, to build the reference models, and so on. And I said, I hereby dub thee data scientists.
There you go. Maybe increase their compensation a bit.
Change your LinkedIn profile now.
Yeah. But I think, I don't know if you've seen this, Seth, but I do see sort of two major different approaches, I guess you could say, in how companies approach AI. One is the highly statistical and data-based approach, which, I'm a little bit more familiar with, having worked with analytics for the last 20 years or so. And then there's the kind of knowledge, language, semantic-oriented approaches, which you've been working on for a while as well. It kind of goes back to my knowledge management days too, and it's almost like never the twain shall meet within many organizations.
Yeah, that is very interesting, and I do see that. I do see them, diverging in many ways. Very different groups. In fact, we're seeing the challenge in some organizations that are trying to do things like personalization at scale. Large technology firm we're working with, there really is an intersection of the predictive analytics and the marketing automation and marketing integration and the semantic side, right? Because you're trying to interpret digital body language of the customer, pulling it from lots of different systems, and then using that to say, well, what does this person want? What can we surface for them? What can they get? What can we give them? What kind of offer? And then getting the analytics back from that and getting the results back from that is right now a manual process. But my perspective is closing that loop and circling back and putting that feedback in will be the way to do personalization scale. So that is that intersection, that direct intersection of the semantic and text and knowledge side with the data analytics and predictive analytics side.
Yeah, I agree. They need to come together. And part of the problem is over the last few years, companies, particularly the tech companies, have gotten so excited about deep learning and these very complex statistical models for analyzing data, even language-oriented data, things like Google Translate and so on. But A, it requires a huge amount of data. B, it's not transparent at all. So if it matters why you're coming up with a particular prediction or recommendation, these technologies are not going to help you much. And I think over the next several years, we're going to see a little bit of a return toward a more balanced approach that considers the semantic or the rules-based or the traditionally linguistic, natural language-oriented applications along with the more statistical ones.
Yeah. I would agree. That is a very tough integration piece, because you have to say, how does the statistical piece, how does the data and the trends in the data and the patterns in the, how do the patterns in the data impact some cognitive or some language processing or interpretation? And yes, you're right. There are statistical approaches that use language. In fact, some of the chatbot approaches, there's a heavy data-intensive approach to those, which, like machine translation, where you're translating, from English to French or Spanish or something, you're actually translating a question into an answer. So it's a very analogous type of a machine learning and machine translation. Rather than translating from one language to another, you're translating a question into an answer, but that requires enormous amounts of data. Have you seen those be successful in organizations?
Well, frankly, I think that was been one of the challenges with IBM Watson applications. Not all of them, but many. Watson, of course, has a number of different APIs, but I think some of the early applications were both that combination of linguistic and statistical, and so you needed a lot of data, and you needed to construct a knowledge graph, or you might describe it an information architecture, and that explained, I think, why some of these projects were not successful. It's just not easy to pull all those capabilities together.
Yeah. And, I remember the early days of the Lotus Discovery Server, which was using statistical approaches. And that same DNA went into OmniFind, and that same DNA went into Watson. So some of those probabilistic algorithms and clustering algorithms and, n-dimensional free space vectors, I like saying n-dimensional free space vectors, kind of sounds cool, are really that approach, which are still used. But again, the training data, I remember at one point we're looking at requiring 1,000 documents per taxonomy node. And so if you have 50 nodes, that's 50,000 documents. Well, you better have a very large corpus. So you had to provide that as the training set. So you better have a very large corpus to process. And that's just a 50 node, 50 terms. I mean, you want to do this across multiple dimensions. You want to do it with much larger ontologies. And so, yes, the statistical approach with linguistic in that scenario was really labor intensive and challenging and difficult to see the value from, because you could actually get a rules-based classifier that would be, significantly easier. A little bit more maintenance, but could be a lot easier in terms of the setup.
Yeah, so, and I just wrote a little piece suggesting that the death of rules, the death of rule engines, has been greatly exaggerated as well. I think there's even though they only really work in relatively simple applications, I think they do have still a lot of appeal. One survey that I did a couple of years ago, 50% of U.S. companies were still using rule engines. So I think, part of the challenge with AI is we need this panoply of technology capabilities, and it's hard to understand them all, and some of them, as used to just go way back. I had a friend who was visiting me who used to work for Lotus. You mentioned Lotus a few minutes ago.
Oh, yeah.
And he said most of the millennials he talks to have never heard of Lotus. And he said, he tells them, when I went to Lotus, it was bigger than Microsoft.
Wow. Yeah. Actually, I have a little section I'm writing about in my book on Lotus in the old days, and what we used to say, Lotus Notes did poorly what nothing else could do at all. It was the precursor to all of this stuff, But so it is interesting to kind of see how these things are evolving. I agree with you that rules-based, when you think about, email processing, for example, some organizations need to process large amounts of support text that comes in via email or text, and you need rules, right? You need someone has to decide where is this email going? I can process it and know what it's about, but then what expert do I send it to, or what department do I send it to? So that's all rules-based. So I don't see any rules-based systems going away completely.
No, and they're, of course, the basis for a lot of RPA as well underneath.
Exactly. Exactly. So we talked a little bit about where you're seeing some initial traction in organizations. I also wanted to mention, you know, search is increasingly considered. You know, people are talking about semantic search. I mean, I don't think there's any other kind of search. I mean, well, there is data search, but I think when people think of full text search, they think of they're calling it something different, but it is essentially the same. But there are things to do when you start looking at building thesaurus structures and ontologies and, you know, classifying intent. There's a lot of work that can be done to improve search in an organization using machine learning algorithms. And, you know, when you think about things like chatbots, those are retrieval mechanisms, and we're starting to see organizations pay more attention to their content and the needs of their users and their use cases, which is really how you have to look at this stuff anyway. But building out these technologies is forcing that examination, that discussion. What are you seeing that's more mature? What are you seeing that's either technologies or approaches that's kind of really showing some advanced capability and maturity? What would you say?
Well, I think the most advanced things are complex combinations of these basic technologies. You know, RPA with a lot of analytics, even deep learning associated with it, or as we were saying before, the combination of semantic and statistical approaches, or there are some makers of rule engines now that will let you go out to APIs and make a decision about, you know, a credit check or something like that, and then feed it back into the rule. Those combinations, I think, are more advanced. And then I do think that deep learning, while not the solution to all of our problems for things like visual and audio recognition, are the best thing out there. And still, for many organizations, pretty advanced. I mean, you have to have some idea of what you're doing, typically some data science skills in order to pull that off. You know, more and more companies have some of that now. But I would put that in the category of more advanced applications. Increasingly, you can get at them with open source tools, things like, you know, TensorFlow and Google Vision and so on. But still, you have to have some human capability for knowing what's going on if you're going to be effective with them, I think.
Yeah, and I think it calls out the need to really look at these processes holistically and from an end-to-end perspective, and realize that in your organization, you're going to need to solve problems in a very unique way, and it will likely take multiple components and multiple tools to be able to solve those problems. You're not going to find, you know, an off-the-shelf technology that you can just plug and play to solve a complex problem in the enterprise. I mean, there are certainly standalone applications that will, you know, help with things like, you know, propensity to buy if you have good data, right? Or there may be some interesting applications around, you know, around search, for example. But again, you still need to be able to configure them and help insert the things that are relevant to your organization. One organization we're working with actually did a project to outsource a robot. It's kind of a robotic process automation, but there's also some semantics in there. There's some virtual assistant, but it's the organization that is offering this as a package service is FICO, right? The credit scoring organization.
Sure.
And what they're doing, they're outsourcing from this financial services firm the customers that are 1 to 29 days overdue on their payment, and they send a batch file out, and they simply execute a bunch of scripts to do outbound calling, email, text, and then they're able to, you know, accept the payment, you know, interact in multiple ways. Is there a lot of AI in there? Well, there's some, but it's really a lot of workflow, a lot of rules, a lot of text analytics to process things, but it becomes a packaged application that is going to have value and is going to be able to demonstrate the value to move things forward. So I think if you see those kinds of applications, you really have to test with your data and your process and your environment.
Yeah, it's that complex integration, not only of the system components, but with your way of doing work and your existing IT architecture, and that, I think, that's always going to be more difficult for organizations. The easy low-hanging fruit is when your vendors of existing transactional systems start to make AI-based tools available. So now, if you want to do predictive lead scoring for your sales force, you could either create it yourself and try to integrate it with your CRM system, or probably a much smarter idea to pay Salesforce.com a few extra bucks a month and get it built in with Salesforce Einstein. That's a pretty easy decision, and the data's there, the user interface is the same. The hard part comes when your vendor doesn't make that yet, and you have to do all the integration yourself.
Right, and that's a great example. And one of the interesting things that this organization I was just mentioning had is they, to your point, their vendor was offering a module to do speech recognition, but it was a cognitive intelligence module, blah, 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 that cost $300,000 or something, right? So that was a big hurdle. Yeah, that was a big hurdle for that piece of software to begin the process. There were other ways to do this, to bolt on as a front end, and one of our guys came up with an architecture that actually worked much more effectively, much more cheaply, but to bolt on another type of technology at the front end. But this whole this FICO piece actually justified building the back end web services and hooks into their transaction systems that then will allow for other experiments. So that was a clear ROI on a packaged tool that is meeting a specific business need, that's also going to pave the way to do other things and build that infrastructure. So I think that's a really good point about that integration piece to be a huge stumbling block.
I think eventually a lot of these AI capabilities will become somewhat commoditized, and everything will be based on APIs. Most of them will be free, in the cloud at least, paid for by the cloud vendors. So you send them the right data in the right format, and back comes a recommendation or a perception or something along those lines that you can just feed right in. But still, there's going to be some integration work to make all that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's happened in the text analytics space. We do have another poll here, and the question is, what types of projects are on the horizon? Is it mostly on the data side, or is it more on the text side, or is it a mix of both? Now, again, you can quibble with my terminology here, but my point is to say, are you doing things that are more like data analytics and predictive analytics, fraud detection and so on, based on hard data and data patterns, or are you doing things that are more around, things like chatbots or semantic search or text analytics and so on, or is it a combination of both? So go ahead and put your vote in if you would. I see a couple of folks more on the data side, it looks like at the moment, and some on the mix of analytic and cognitive. But I do agree with you, Tom, that is definitely where we're starting to see, and it's like you don't have to build the heavy lifting algorithms to do speech recognition, for example, right?
Somebody's done that for you.
Exactly. Yep. So in terms of your experience with this, where are you seeing those projects? Are you seeing them? You're seeing them more on the analytics side, I would imagine, based on some of the work you've done.
I mean, companies are probably more likely to talk to me about that sort of thing. But I do occasionally I work with companies that are putting in intelligent agents, chatbots in some cases. You know, I think they're now, what did I read the other day? There are over 150 different chatbot offerings out there that you can use that somebody else has developed. So that's rapidly becoming quite commoditized. And I think the differentiation is not in can you recognize text or speech, but can you come back with a really great answer to the customer's problem? And as you've said for a long time, that requires some really good information architecture work.
Yeah, we were just running a workshop with an insurance company this week, and it's interesting because they were looking at speech and text as different, but really they're the same. I mean, in some ways they were looking at some distinction, but at the end of the day, you have to do speech recognition, convert it to text so that the computer can interpret it. But they were a little bit surprised at the level of depth required on the architecture side, and that's certainly something that we're seeing. My point here, so that our next topic is, what do you recommend that organizations consider when they're starting? And of course, my mantra is always the IA piece, right? There's no AI without IA. You can't have artificial intelligence if you don't have good data. The data is more important than the algorithm. What else would you say, Tom? What else do you think organizations should think about, consider?
Well, there's still, I think, a need for talent in general. Certainly, I agree that companies can prosper by using talent from outside to some degree, but if you're going to make this a core capability, you're going to need some internal talent, and talent for AI is in short supply. I think that I just published a piece today in Forbes about an organization, Principal Financial Group in Des Moines, not widely known as the Center for AI Talent, Des Moines, Iowa, I think it's fair to say. And so this guy, who's the chief data scientist at Principal, pursued a very good strategy of sort of building out his ecosystem. He used crowdsourcing, he used consultants, he uses capstone projects in data science and analytics programs at universities. Wow. He had over 60 of those underway. So I think if you're creative, you can make that talent problem go away a bit, but you've got to work at it.
The thing that's really interesting, because that is a huge gap. My philosophy is much of the heavy lifting is being done by some of the larger vendors, but you still do need, we were doing a predictive analytics project for a credit card company, and it was about optimizing their offers. And even though they had a data science team, they just didn't have the bandwidth, right? So we outsourced that for them and had very good results. I think the other thing that we're observing, and especially with large enterprises, is being really clear about the business outcome, recognizing that you're going to have short-term goals and long-term goals that may be somewhat inconsistent. I'll give you a quick example. For these guys, they're experimenting with, text-based support and chat support, and one of the vendors is great. They love them. They're doing their chat bots, and they're doing the updates, and they're very responsive. They're not terribly expensive. The performance is good. But guess what? They don't have the access to the knowledge, to the content, right? They have to kind of give it to them. And what we were saying is, look, that's not going to work long term, because you're losing control of your secret sauce, right? If your way of interacting with customers and supporting customers is based on, the knowledge of your products and services and, the whole tone of the brand and how you relate, you have to have that internally, right? So that short term might be okay to prove a point or to work out other aspects of the operationalization, but long term, that can't be the strategy. right? So what are your thoughts about sort of those short-term, versus long-term, and how to balance those kinds of needs and objectives?
Well, in my book, this newer book, The AI Advantage, I probably come across as a bit of a Debbie Downer, in the sense that I think a lot of these long-term moonshots, or maybe what I mean to say is, it's short-term moonshots that are the problem.
Yeah.
Moonshots are by definition going to take place over the long term. So,
right.
The only
right.
moonshots that we had as a country were, multiple different space missions that ultimately led us to the moon. But each one kind of put a little piece in place, and I think AI is the same way. The low-hanging fruit is by far more likely to be successful, but if you're only doing these really short-term, easy projects, you're not going to get any competitive differentiation. You're not going to disrupt anything. So I think putting a number of those together in a plan, obviously the plan is going to change over time, but something that's really going to change customer interaction in your organization, or really going to change the quality of advice that you provide, or a big goal implemented in a series of smaller steps. So think big, start small is my advice these days.
That's a wonderful way to look at that, because I agree. If you start off with this big monstrous project and it's going to be tens of millions of dollars, it's likely going to be a problem, because it's high risk, it's high visibility, it's high complexity, but I think having that goal, building that roadmap to say, okay, this is where we want to be, and maybe that's very ambitious, but we see a lot of incremental steps toward that process, through that process to get there, and wins along the way. And one of the things that I was helping this insurance company understand is, look, to build what you want to build eventually, you can start off by improving the capabilities and the efficiency today of your call center by engineering the knowledge and doing it and componentizing and doing it in such a way that you can actually serve multiple purposes. And then you can still work toward this long-term goal. So I think there's a lot of challenges, a lot of misconceptions, that they didn't really understand the role of knowledge engineering in that context. What other misconceptions do you see, and what do you think people should do to try to overcome them? I mean,
I think there's just a highly inflated set of ideas about what AI can do in the society at large. I mean, you were talking about autopilot before, autonomous vehicles. Everybody talks about them as if they're just around the corner. I was talking with a woman who's now at J.P. Morgan Chase, helping spend that $5 billion a year in AI R&D, and she said she was formerly head of machine learning at Carnegie Mellon, and she said, when I first came to Carnegie Mellon in 1985, people were saying autonomous vehicles just around the corner, but clearly
define your corner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Clearly not here yet in any substantial way. And so I think we just have to be quite skeptical about how quickly all this transformational stuff can happen. Doesn't mean we don't need a plan for it, and we need to move in that direction. But certainly nothing is going to happen overnight, except really small things that aren't going to make a huge difference. I mean, AI in general is good for handling small tasks. It doesn't do entire jobs, even, God forbid, entire processes, unless you string together a bunch of things. So I don't know. It's not necessarily a popular message to say that, but I think it's undeniably true.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's still so many misconceptions about the big, secret sauce, algorithmic, this little startup who has all this venture funding has a secret black box that's going to do all this stuff. And anybody who's been in the space who's gone down that path and said, okay, I'll try this, I'll listen, I'll check it out, finds it's just not there. It's really not true. I mean, there's lots of promises, there's lots of hype, there's lots of nonsense, but it's like if you can't understand it, and I think even if you're talking about neural networks, you might not understand the deep piece, but the application has to make sense. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And I think if it doesn't, then you can't believe in the magic and the silver bullets and all that stuff. And I think it's unfortunate that this industry has so much of that, but I think you just got to get down to the reality of the algorithm is only as good as the data, and you need to understand your processes. You can't automate a mess, right? So you need to understand the process, to understand your business need, and you can't automate something you don't understand. So I think that's a big piece. Any other closing thoughts, Tom, for folks? All right, it's a time here.
Well, I think the good news is there's so much stuff happening in AI, so many vendors working on it, so many companies applying it, that we're not going to go back into another AI winter ever, I suspect.
Yeah.
We're not going to fall into the trough of disillusionment or despair or whatever it is, because this stuff is very powerful. It's just it's hard to do.
Yeah. It's hard to do, and I think looking at that, I really like your way of looking at those incremental pieces, and that isn't that people don't necessarily want to hear that it's a lot of hard work and that you got to get there incrementally, but have that big picture vision. But it is what it is, Work is hard.
Exactly.
That's why they call it. Yeah. But well, listen, Tom, thank you again for participating today. That was great, a lot of fun, and for those of you who would like to have other conversations, please feel free. I did miss the question. I'm so sorry. Can you have true cognitive solutions without ontologies? Since we're right at the top of at the end of the session here, I'm going to just answer this quickly and say I think you have to have ontologies. It says backward propagation is called AI, but it can be broken down into mathematical processes. ML, machine learning, is simply an algorithm. That is absolutely true. So I agree with this. I agree with your statement, and I am in support of this. Anyway, I just wanted to answer that quickly. Thank you for that question. And again, Tom, thank you, and thanks for folks who are listening. If you want to have other conversations, feel free to give us a shout, and we can set up a discussion about what you're doing and how you want to proceed. So there you are. There's info@early.com, and you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. So again, thanks for your time, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Seth. You too.
Thanks. You too. Bye now.